please put your hand together and welcome Valentina.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really happy to be here. So I really like to start with this slide because my background is more in neuroscience and addiction neuroscience. So what we focus on is pretty much the brain and what happens in the brain when people are addicted, or in relation to relapse, or in relation to recreational use compared to dependent use, right? But oftentimes the language that we use in neuroimaging research, in neuroscientific research, is quite different from the language, the very language and the context of treatment, for example, or policy or public health. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And every time I present to clinical treatment services, I just want to emphasize that I would love to hear your input as well. And I really think it's important to reflect on what are the key issues that come from interventions and treatment, because these are the very issues that inform our research as well. Yeah. So I do, even though I'll be presenting today, this is a bit of a different presentation today to what I'm used to do normally. Normally I present mostly about my work on my team's work, my collaborators' work on the neural and cognitive correlates of addiction, including cannabis use or alcohol use and dependence, and other addictions as well. But today I'm going to present some of the new research that we've been developing in this space as well. It moves more towards an intervention space and trying to map the neural, cognitive, but also mental health correlates of interventions, and also in a little bit more in a public health space as well, whereby we've been working with some people to try and standardize the assessment of cannabis use in order to be able to inform the development of harm reduction guidelines as well. So today it's a bit of a mixed bag, and I've been talking with Vicky Manning as well. I've been talking with Dan about, presenting perhaps something a little bit novel that could be also a little bit more relevant to what you do here, perhaps. So I'm going to focus on cannabis, and I really like this slide because it's just summarizing the high prevalence rate of cannabis use, which is about 200 million people globally. Cannabis is the first illicit substance of use in Australia as well, and I think most of you in this room have known or have treated or know or currently do smoke cannabis for recreational or medical purposes. So cannabis is really everywhere. And what I find always amazing in this research space is that despite the high prevalence rates of cannabis use and all the harms that are also associated with the regular use of cannabis, we don't really know very much about what are the fundamental mechanisms of cannabis use. We don't know who are the most vulnerable users. We don't know what are the factors that confer more vulnerability to some people than others to experience more adverse outcomes. By adverse outcomes, I mean cannabis dependence, which occurs only in about 10% of the regular cannabis users. Therefore, not everybody who uses cannabis becomes dependent, and that's actually it's actually interesting as well that because of this, most likely people have very divided opinion about cannabis and whether cannabis has adverse effects. Cannabis is a very polarizing substance. A lot of people think that it's absolutely harmless. Actually, it's good for you, and many other people think it's really, really bad for you. So it's a very, very polarizing substance, and oftentimes these debates occur in a complete scientific vacuum. And I say this as a researcher who has been studying cannabis and its correlates for about 10 years, which might not be much compared to many of the people sitting here that you've been researching probably for longer, but that's all I've been focusing. That's where the majority of my work has focused on. Okay, something that is of interest as well is that it seems like between 2000 and 2014, the potency of cannabis products seems to increase. Okay, so it means that street cannabis that is available now seems to be more potent than the street cannabis that was available 10 years ago, for instance. And it's still not very well known what are the consequences of having cannabis products that are more potent in the street. And some of these issues in not understanding why, what are the adverse consequences of having higher potent cannabis products is because we actually don't know very well how to measure cannabis potency. And in research studies, we often fail to measure what kind of cannabis people have been smoking. Because as you might know, cannabis is a plant. Has about 400 different cannabinoid compounds. Some of them are psychoactive. The most widely researched are THC, which is the psychoactive compound that has addiction liability. It's psychotogenic. And CBD, which seems to be mitigating the addictive effect of THC and has opposite effect on anxiety, for example. It's being used as, more and more as an anxiolytic or as an antidepressant. So there's a lot of trials that are currently going on to try and establish what are the benefits of CBD for mental health and or also for reducing pain. But the evidence so far is quite inconclusive and very, very early. So the studies that we have thus far in this space are very preliminary, and often they lack active placebo control conditions, and often they're not appropriately randomized because it's a very new area of research. So, as you can see, what I'm trying to say with this is that despite the fact that cannabis is very highly prevalent and there is a higher prevalence, there's an increase in the potency of cannabis products, we don't really know very much about how does it affect mental health or the brain or cognition. So I'm going to present some preliminary findings in this space. Okay, anything else? So here is just a list of potential side effects from cannabis consumption. This is a slide I also like because often people are not aware of the fact that cannabis dependence is actually quite, it's a problem of, it's a significant issue in treatment services globally. And a lot of, oftentimes people are surprised to hear this, and cannabis often is not viewed as a substance that could cause addiction or dependence, but the statistics actually confirm that cannabis is a major problem in treatment services. Okay, so it's very, very important given the high prevalence rates of cannabis use. These numbers do represent a minority of users. So imagine that of about 200 million users, about 10% are estimated to be regular users. About 10% of the regular users are estimated to have more severe cannabis dependence. Okay, so even though these represents a minority of individuals, this minority of individuals represent a significant amount of people. So it's very, very important to me as a research interest and personal interest. For me, it's very, very important to try and unpack what are the correlates of cannabis use. I'm very interested in understanding the neurobiology of cannabis use, the cognitive correlates, but also to conduct research that can inform the public on what are the harms and also what might mitigate, what are the factors that could mitigate the adverse effects of cannabis use. Okay, and oftentimes we start talking a lot about potentially, well, we know that the cannabis markets are changing very, very rapidly. Okay, so there is an increase in legal cannabis markets. There is an increase in several international jurisdictions, such as in Canada, the USA, and Uruguay. And in several countries, there are permissive stances towards the use of cannabis. And cannabis is being increasingly accepted in modern medicine to be used for medical purposes. And the concerns about this decriminalization of cannabis products is that more products could be available. Therefore, there could be some vulnerable users that will be more likely to be exposed to cannabis and to experience adverse mental health outcomes or cognitive outcomes. Or young people might start using cannabis, and this might affect their school attainment, for example, in their cognitive performance. And even though the cognitive performance deficits or alterations that are selected to some domains of cognition, such as learning and memory, for example, or disinhibition, these deficits might be temporary, but we still don't know whether using cannabis amongst young people whether these deficits, although temporary, might actually cause less school, unimpaired school performance, for example, or performing less at university, and that perhaps might reduce access to better professions later in life. So, you know, there's a lot of issues that remain unresolved and that we don't know very much about, but it's really worth exploring this space. Okay, so. Usually my research, this is a bit of a summary slide of the research I usually present, is about mapping the neurobiological correlates of cannabis use. So if you start from this side, and the top here, this part of the slide highlights what are factors that we have identified so far to be associated with worse brain outcomes in cannabis users. Rather than actually calling them brain outcomes, let's call them differences between cannabis users and people who do not smoke cannabis. And so we've been observing consistent alterations in brain volumes and in brain structure, particularly in samples that have been using more heavily. So samples of cannabis users that smoke more heavily for a more prolonged period of time, they are the samples where we tend to report more consistently volumetric reduction or in specific brain regions that are very high in cannabinoid receptors and that are very strongly implicated in reward processing. So some of this evidence then suggests that perhaps cannabis might affect specifically some brain regions that are very high in cannabinoid receptors, because repeated exposure to cannabinoids targets very specific brain pathways. And in the long term, these might become altered as a result of this. Okay. Nevertheless, most of this evidence is correlational. Is not, so we have not established whether these brain alterations predated cannabis use onset. And some studies actually show that some brain alterations predate cannabis use onset, particularly in regions implicated in inhibitory control, in disinhibition. But other studies show that there is this reduction in brain volumes is associated with earlier age of cannabis use onset, or higher dosage, or higher psychotic-like symptoms in cannabis users. Therefore, this evidence suggests that perhaps heavy users are more vulnerable to volumetric alterations. And then with another number of studies in this section B, we've been showing that within the hippocampus, which is a key brain region for learning, memory, and stress, within the hippocampus, we've been observing, the hippocampus is the most consistently examined brain regions in neuroimaging studies of cannabis users. So we have a lot of evidence from these samples, okay? Specifically about the hippocampus. We don't know very much about the rest of the brain in cannabis users because there's less studies looking at other brain regions, okay? And what we know is that we've done a number of studies whereby we've actually been taking data from a multi-site consortia consisting of the Enigma Addiction Working Group, which collates data from thousands of people across the world from different studies. Researchers have decided to put together their data so that they could have more power to detect existing subtle effects associated with addiction. And I've been working within this consortium and with this other European consortium to have more power to look at subtle effects of cannabis use. And the main research question has been segregating cannabis users with dependence and without dependence. And the question is, do we see brain alterations within the hippocampus and other brain regions only independent users compared to not, or do we see these alterations also in people who are not dependent? So we're talking about those users that have been smoking recreationally for, 20 years or 5 years, or it doesn't matter how long, but people that might be able to quit relatively easily, people who do not report to a very strong craving, people who don't report to have significant issues in relation to their use, okay? So what we've been finding is that these alterations within the hippocampus and actually also other brain regions of, that are implicated in reward processing, they're called like the coded, they're part of the striatum. And what we've seen is that only dependent cannabis users show alterations within these brain circuits. And people who smoke cannabis recreationally, they have similar volumes and similar measures of brain structure to controls. So this cluster of studies suggests that perhaps dependent users are actually more vulnerable to the adverse impact of cannabis use. And these effects might not be related to exposure to cannabis per se, rather to the dependence process. Okay, and this is very interesting because, again, in clinical treatment services, often you might not see recreational cannabis users who present for problems with cannabis use. You actually might see the people who experience adverse effects in relation to their use, right? So in this way, this evidence is still is from a number of different multi-site neuroimaging studies. However, we've been running these projects for about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years so far, so this evidence is still early. And another comment here is that the quality of the research in this space tends to be also quite low, in the sense that a lot of the studies who examine cannabis users, they tend to focus on regular cannabis users, and their recruitment criteria, usually the inclusion criteria, are regular cannabis use, and each study has a different cutoff. Some studies by regular use mean twice a week or twice a month or 5 times a year. It really depends on each individual study. And a lot of studies do not measure cannabis dependence and whether people experience problems with their use. Therefore, a lot of the evidence that has been generated thus far might be might not tell us much about the vulnerable users, the vulnerable cannabis users, because we're putting everybody in the same basket, okay? Both problem users and non-problem users. Therefore, we might have some conflated effects in there that we can't so we can't unpack from a lot of the studies so far who are the vulnerable users and who are the users who do not experience issues. So this is about this bit. I'm going to focus on this section now. Another very early body of work, we started running some, actually this is a study that we've run with Dan and also Murat Yücel at the Monash University as well, Nadia Solowi at the University of Wollongong. So what we've done in this specific study, we had a sample of regular cannabis users, and we actually did hair analysis to examine levels of CBD, cannabidiol, which is the very famous now and popular antipsychotic compound. And we also measure levels of THC from a hair analysis as well. Now, hair analysis of cannabinoids are supposed to reflect about 3 months of exposure. So everything sediments into your hair. So the longer the hair, the longer the history you can have about substance use. Okay? And so reliably, usually we can measure about the last 3 months of exposure. So it's not a measure of lifetime exposure. We can't get to that with anything other than self-report and detailed history, but it's one of the most robust measures of exposures that we have. So from hair analysis, what we have found is that cannabis users who had high level of CBD in their hair sample and also high level of THC, those cannabis users, they did not show volumetric differences of the hippocampus compared to controls. While those cannabis users where we couldn't see any CBD and we saw only THC, those were the cannabis users who again showed volumetric reductions compared to controls. What I'm trying to say with this is that it seems like having access to cannabis with high level of CBD in addition to THC seems to have potentially a protective effect, or it seems to mitigate the adverse effect of THC on brain anatomy in this case. But a lot of evidence, actually early evidence on acute administration of THC and CBD combined also show similar results, whereby THC administered alone does cause high or feelings of paranoia, and those effects seems to be mitigated when CBD is co-administered with THC. So when we're talking about the change in the potency of street cannabis, where THC level increase over time, it's then very important to know, well, is CBD also high in the strict cannabis, or is it something that is it decreasing? Because if we have more access to cannabis that is very potent, but without CBD, perhaps the effects of this type of cannabis might be a little bit more harmful for the brain, for cognition, for mental health. So this is where things are at the moment. There's a lot of speculation in this space, and there's more and more studies that are currently being run that administer THC and CBD separately all together, and we're trying to unpack these effects. Okay, now in this space, we've been running some the studies. Actually, these were studies run at the University of Wollongong, and these two pictures represent results from the same sample. So these are results from an open label trial led by, which was funded by NHMRC, and again, the chief investigator was Nadia Solowi, the University of Wollongong. And what we've done with this study is we administered for 10 weeks CBD, okay, to cannabis users that normally smoke cannabis, and they could keep going smoking cannabis as well as they underwent this treatment, okay. So every day cannabis users took a couple of pills of CBD, and then participants were scanned before and after. And this open label trial, the goal of this trial was to see whether exposure to CBD, does it change at all, any measures of brain integrity or cognitive measures. Okay, so here I'm reporting measures of functional connectivity here and measure of brain integrity. Again, this one represents the hippocampus, and what we could see from this sample is that the volume within this of this brain region of the hippocampus increased within specific subregions in people with cannabis use. So the idea is that perhaps administration of CBD in addition to cannabis use might mitigate some of the adverse effects of cannabis on the brain in this case. And in this slide, these are preliminary findings. We've just had, the very, very recent. We analyzed the functional connectivity between the hippocampus and amygdala, both regions very high in cannabinoid receptors, in the same sample. And what we saw is that there was a change in the connectivity between these two regions and other brain regions. Okay, so again, this study suggests that administering CBD might somehow mitigate some of the adverse effects or some of the brain measures that we consistently observe to be altered in cannabis users compared to non-users. Another factor of interest in this sample is that this open-label trial also led to some other, this evidence has been published, this evidence is being written. Another study from this sample was published, and it did show that anxiety symptoms and depressive symptoms, they were reduced in cannabis users pre to post CBD administration. And we didn't see a significant change in psychotic-like symptoms. Okay, so I usually present on these findings, but today I'm going to move a little bit more forward because let's say I've done cannabis research for my PhD and very heavily focused on the brain correlates of cannabis use, and then as part of my postdoc I went down this path and I actually wanted to unpack the role of dependence compared to recreational use. Then I went to the UK, to Liverpool, where there were other researchers, and I started talking to other people doing research in this space, particularly some collaborators now at University College London, and they've done some work in terms of intervention in people with risky substance use. Okay, so I started working with them in terms of let's see whether we can design an intervention, a behavioral intervention, because my background is I have a master in clinical psychology, so I also want to bring together this expertise in neuroimaging and do more of an intervention study to see whether we can change or reverse some of these brain alterations after a behavioral intervention. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. In this slide, actually, this is another slide. In this slide, actually, this is another overview of brain alterations in cannabis users, whereby here it's an illustration of brain regions that are more consistently reported to be altered in cannabis users on the left. So the higher the color, the more alterations are reported by studies thus far. But what you have here on the right is another map that shows the concentration of cannabinoid receptors in the brain. So as you can see, there's a lot of overlap with these two maps. And this is to show that we seem to observe alterations more consistently in areas that are very high with cannabinoid receptors. Therefore, these brain alterations don't just occur throughout the brain. They seem to target specific regions that are high in receptors. Okay. And this is a recent meta-analysis that has compared adolescent and adult cannabis users to non-users and has mapped alterations in brain function. And what this meta-analysis revealed is that brain pathways that are implicated in reward processing and inhibitory control and in craving seem to be more consistently altered in cannabis users compared to control. Okay, so this point potentially to brain circuit that might confer vulnerability for craving and potentially experiencing stronger craving that would lead to relapse. And therefore, these alterations have been interpreted as potentially underlying the addiction cycle or neuroadaptations in the brain that occur when someone is using cannabis on a regular basis. Okay. And so here is just a picture of the addiction cycle whereby being exposed to cannabis-related cues might activate an anticipatory response in specific brain regions, and this anticipation then causes craving, and therefore that will cause relapse. And this is the addiction cycle summarized in this corner. Okay, so now I'm going to present about the mindfulness intervention space because this is the intervention study, right? It's in this space. So what we know about mindfulness-based intervention in addiction is that there are a number of interventions available, and this structure is about 4 to 8 weeks of interventions, often they're delivered in a group format, and there's a number of different mindfulness-based interventions, okay? And what we know from a recent meta-analysis is that mindfulness-based interventions is associated with a reduction of dosage, reduction of cravings, reduced withdrawals, with reduced stress levels, and increased cognitive control. And these are meta-analytic findings that have been observed across a number of studies. Therefore, this evidence suggests that mindfulness might be a potentially useful strategy to support abstinence or to reduce craving in substance users. One of the issues, however, of this evidence here is that a lot of these interventions are very structured. They occur in a group setting and they occur twice a week, and they're very, very heavily structured. Therefore, one of my considerations, and clearly I'm not the only one, is that how do we get people with an addiction or people who are not even motivated to get out of bed in the morning or to go to work to turn up for group classes that are highly structured. And I wouldn't be able to do that, to be honest. So one of the things I found interesting is that there are a lot of potential interventions that can be delivered in a way that is more accessible to people, in a way that might help keep high retention rates. So we've been working on an intervention then. I've been looking at this literature, at this specific study run by some collaborators at UCL, whereby they have delivered an ultra-brief mindfulness intervention that lasted only about a week, and it was delivered to people who are at-risk drinkers from the community recruited in London. So what they found that I thought it was very interesting is that there was a significant reduction in the dosage, in how much alcohol people were drinking just after practicing these strategies for about a week. So my interest then was, how can I apply this to cannabis dependence, and can we validate these findings in cannabis dependence? And so we use a similar protocol whereby Okay, whereby we are selecting at the moment, this study is just ongoing at the moment, we're actually starting recruitment now, whereby we have a brief mindfulness intervention and a relaxation, active placebo-controlled relaxation group, and a non-intervention group. And all these three groups consist of cannabis users assessed at baseline and assessed 2 weeks later after they've been practicing this strategy for 2 weeks. So again, these two interventions are completely matched in terms of number of words, complexity, readability, and they are audio interventions that are about, they're kind of audio tracks that you can't formally call mindfulness. They're mindfulness-based strategies, but they're more strategies that help people acknowledge when they're craving and make space for the craving so that they can hold on with the urge rather than giving in and smoking and being intoxicated. So if this strategy was successful and helped anyone to say no to a joint before, let's say, driving a car and picking up the kids from school, then I think that would be a very effective achievement. So we are measuring severity of dependence on cannabis, we're measuring cognition, so inhibitory control, attentional bias, inhibitory control, attentional bias, and stop signal task, that's inhibitory control, working memory as well, before and after. And we're doing MRI scans as well to measure the function of specific brain pathways, okay? So we're measuring brain function during a craving task and brain function during a resting state task where people just sit down and just don't think about anything specifically. So the idea and the main goal of this study is to examine whether the craving networks of the brain, whether the hyperactivity that has been observed changes pre to post. And we have quite a robust design whereby we have an active placebo-matched control condition and a no intervention condition with the cannabis users that will not undergo any intervention, where we do exactly the same brain behavioral and clinical testing as well. We also have a healthy control group, only at baseline, because the group will not do the intervention as well. And this is the PhD student that is driving the project, and she's also a mindfulness teacher, so it's very, very good to have someone on board that has insight knowledge. And what we will give people is an audio track with a web link whereby they can just access it every day and will be able to monitor whether they listen to the audio track rather than not. Okay, and another aspect of the study that I think is worth mentioning is that it's double blind, whereby whoever is running the testing is not aware of what kind of group allocation is going on for the participant, and that's very important. But clearly it's being quite tricky in terms of the design, because we always need a couple of people at the testing site to make sure that we're doing everything right without someone knowing, the main tester, who is who has been allocated to which condition. So that's pretty much the intervention that I've explained. We're gonna we gave audio tracks to all the participants, and at the moment we're advertising in social media, Facebook, Country, and we're doing a very extensive online screening survey. Based on this information, we decide how to allocate cannabis users to various intervention groups. Right, and based on assessment, it also has, in addition to cognitive testing and MRI testing, also consists of urine toxicology to confirm the cannabis users are indeed using cannabis, and also if there are any changes in THC levels between baseline and follow-up. Okay, so that's the first part. I just wanted to introduce this study, and the reason why I also wanted to present this study to this audience is because clearly you're based at Turning Point, so if you're interested in this intervention, please let me know. I will be very happy to collaborate or answer your questions. And I also want to emphasize that we are aware that mindfulness is not for everybody, so we are not in any way, we don't think that everybody will respond well to mindfulness, and there's a lot of individual variability, and some people might be more responsive to the intervention than others. Okay, and here I'm going to talk about in the next 5 minutes about a new initiative that involves the measurement of cannabis dosage, which is a very slippery slope, and it's something that is very hard to do, and soon you'll know why. And for this reason, actually, we've made with Dr. Tom Freeman at University of Bath and Dr. Chandni Hindocha at UCL, we've created this whole day workshop just before Lisbon Addictions, and it's about bringing people together to discuss issues surrounding the measurement of cannabis exposure. And that is because we really don't know how to measure cannabis use, and everybody does it very, very differently, and we really have to come together as experts in the field and come to not necessarily a decision, but come to an agreement of what is the right direction for us to work towards. Because if we don't know how to measure cannabis use, how can we inform, how can we generate knowledge that relates to policy guidelines? How can we develop guidelines for harm reduction if we don't even know how to measure cannabis use to begin with? And I'm very happy about this initiative because we've been writing about the measurement of cannabis for quite a while, but it doesn't seem to be a very sexy topic because it's about measurement. But if you think about the implication of it, they're quite major. So it's very, very good to work in this space. So as you know, yes, cannabis is a very topical topic. And when I went to the US and Canada in June, you'll see some pictures from that visit. I came across a lot of magazines, and they made the news. And cannabis has been legalized in Canada just a couple of months ago. So cannabis products, their potency, methods of use are changing rapidly. There's more and more oral cannabis being used, for example. There's a lot of different cannabis products that are becoming more and more available to people. And these are some pictures from a coffee shop. And if you can see, like here is 200 milligrams THC distillate, 300 milligrams THC. Usually, a regular cannabis users can get high with about 10 milligram THC. So if you think about the potency of these products, you can just realize that there are a lot of highly potent cannabis products available, and also low potent cannabis products. But I'm saying this is what we started finding in the streets of Vancouver. And here are a number of other products as well. There's edibles. Okay, and here you can see the warnings, here in the packaging as well. Adolescents are at greater risk of harms or cannabis and so on. So if we look at the heterogeneity of cannabis products, I just put together this slide just to convey that, for example, now we have the gummy bears. That's something that we really didn't see much of before, right? And you have dabbing, lots of vape pens. So again, we really don't know how to measure what people are being exposed to if they come to studies, but also from a public health perspective, we're not quite sure about, whether smoking one thing rather than another is more harmful for you. So the way, so in this slide, I'm summarizing another issue about measuring cannabis units or exposure. As you can see here, this slide, the content is just to show that there's a lot of variability in the concentration of THC and CBD in cannabis products. Therefore, smoking one joint for somebody might not equate as smoking a joint for someone else if they smoke cannabis with different potencies. And there's a lot of variability also within each country. Within Australia, different regions of Australia, cannabis comes from a plant, and different plants have different potencies. Okay, so this is just to illustrate the point. And then also here is to show that there's a lot of heterogeneity in methods of administration of cannabis products. As you can see, there's different ways to smoke a joint, and you can combine it with tobacco rather than not. And having tobacco in cannabis seems to also increase the addiction liability of cannabis as well. And cannabis in Australia, we only have a slide here where this study has been published in 2013. So I remember when this was presenting well before 2013, where she was trying to get access to this data from police seizures. And so this data is the most recent data that we have from Australia, as far as I know, from 2013, the publication, so probably 5-6 years ago at least, they started doing this project. But as you can see, a key message here is that you can see the concentration of THC is very, very high. particularly in relation to the concentration of CBD. So it seems like, according to this, in Australia, there's very potent cannabis products with very low CBD, and potentially this has implications for higher addiction liability or higher intoxication, higher highs amongst people who smoke cannabis. But we really are in urgent need of updated measurements of cannabis potency. And what we can see here in Europe, there are some plots showing that there is a steady increase in the potency of cannabis products between 2006 and 2016. So again, this is showing trends towards increasing potency. And it's often because people who smoke cannabis regularly, they're actually after cannabis products that are quite potent and that can give them the high. Often that's exactly what people are looking for. And again, similar trends in the US and in Europe combined together, increases of products over time. And this is sinsemilla particularly. It's a particular variety of cannabis that is more potent. As you can see, there are increases over time, okay? And increased potency of THC over time. Why this is important? Because according to some epidemiological studies, using very high potent cannabis varieties it makes it more likely to experience a psychotic-like episode, for example. And this is just one of the potential adverse outcomes of having high potent cannabis products. And what we know is that CBD might mitigate some of the adverse outcomes of THC on mental health. So far, this is a bit of a summary of all the studies that have tried to develop consensus or measure of cannabis use. How do we standardize cannabis exposure? So there's the notion of standard joint unit, which is good because smoking joints is very common in Europe. However, lots of people don't smoke joints anymore, and how do we address measurement of dabbing or gummy bears and other methods of administration? But also, and also it doesn't address what are the THC and CBD levels in cannabis products. So here in this table, there are some details, but the key message is that what doesn't get addressed with these measures of cannabis use is that they can't address the heterogeneity in THC and CBD level in the cannabis products, and often they don't address the fact that different people don't just smoke joints or bongs or edibles. We need to have a measure that can help us understand the risks and harms of using different types of cannabis products as well, because that's what people use, and that's what we should start to try and understand. So, okay, and when we look at Canada, for example, lower risk guidelines for cannabis use, we can see that the recommendations are they're not very, They're based on choosing low-strength products, such as products that have lower levels of THC, or they're a little bit vague in terms of trying to limit your use as much as possible, okay? And currently, we don't have standard cannabis units that can inform the general public about how much THC you should be exposed to at maximum if you want to avoid adverse outcomes, okay? If you want to avoid adverse outcomes. So how long should you not drive for if you just had a joint? Okay. So here just I have some summary slides about the NIDA Cannabis Policy Working Group, which emphasizes that there is a need to develop standardized measures of cannabis exposure to be able to inform public health recommendations as well. And in Australia, we have these guidelines for medicinal use. If you look at the effect of dosing, it remains a little bit vague. What is the standard dosage that should be recommended to people? It's still not very much evidence-based because we don't have the evidence to inform this. And as you can see here, for example, we have this statement. There's little information on dose response. Okay, so what we have come up with is with Tom Freeman and Chandni, we've been discussing that we do, based on the evidence, it doesn't seem like there are strong evidence-based guidelines, okay? And the guidelines that we have so far to guide users, they're not strongly evidence-based because we don't have a strong, thorough measure of dosage. And so our proposal that it's under review at the moment is to base standardized units on the quantity of the actual pharmacological active compound of THC, because that can be linked to a specific window of time that the THC, for example, requires to become active. And if you smoke orally, for example, then the effects will have a specific length, where if you ingest the same quantity, you can attach that unit to a specific period of time, okay? So we've come up with this proposal, and we don't feel like, based on the evidence, there is enough to come up with an approximate standard unit for CBD, because the evidence is extremely early and there's more experimental evidence from THC. So the reason why we've been thinking about this is because perhaps having a standardized measure of THC, similar to what's been done for standard drinks, for example. Standard drinks are based on how many milligrams of alcohol are contained in a standard drink. They can be attached to harm reduction guidelines, so that people can relate to, okay, I'm getting 1 unit or 2 units and 3 units. This is the extent of intoxication that I'm going to get into if I'm going to use this specific product. Okay. So again, this is extremely early and it's just a proposal for discussion, really. But for example, in this joint that we got in Vancouver, you can see here you only have the milligrams. So it might be hard for people to just relate to milligrams and understand, you know, how long you're going to be intoxicated for if you take this amount of milligrams. If this was translated perhaps in cannabis units or THC units, it might help people understand how long they might be intoxicated for. So clearly there's some challenges, whereby if you take THC orally rather than if you ingest the same amount, the bioavailability of either route of administration is quite different. So it's higher if you inhale THC rather than oral. So you might we might come up with guidelines such as, if you are exposed to 5 milligrams THC by inhaling it or smoking it, you might be impaired for this amount of time. But if you take it orally, you might be not be able to drive for a longer amount of time, for example. And clearly another challenge is that there are subjective effects based on different topologies of use. And so that's something that we can't resolve. People might just inhale more and more often than other people. And so there are just some issues in trying to understand how much being exposed to a specific unit affects the functioning. Yes, so there are some ambiguities, that some issues that we might not have in alcohol research, where you can actually drink a drink and you know exactly how much you have drunk. However, the consideration is that it's advantageous to have a fixed THC unit in this case for labeling, for example. It can help different people, again, to relate to one specific unit and the consequences of use. And I'm not going to go in detail through the next couple of slides. It's more just to expose you and share with you what are the issues that we've been thinking about in this space. Well, we've been thinking about how many THC milligrams could constitute a standard THC unit, and we felt that 5 milligrams might be a good unit, because usually most regular users are intoxicated when exposed to 2 to 8 THC milligrams based on experimental studies. And being exposed to about 10 milligrams or more, it seems to lead to adverse reactions in people who are occasional cannabis users. Therefore, having a standard unit that is a little bit less than what someone would smoke if he's a regular user might help from a public health perspective to not promote very heavy use. And other challenges is that clearly cannabis products don't only have THC and CBD. There's about 400 cannabinoid compounds in there. And we actually don't know what their interaction is and how in relation to causing intoxication and effects on the brain or mental health or any effects really. So clearly it's a very challenging space where to work on. So That's it. So I just wanted to, thank you so much for listening. So today I've really presented from brain evidence to interventions and the public health space. So I appreciate that it's a very mixed bag of topics, but I think it's a rapidly developing landscape and there's a lot of challenges. So we're working in this direction. Thank you so much.